Hi everybody, welcome to Inspirited Live, and this week our topic is Daniel and the end of time. So before we begin, let's just start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for opportunity that we can come together to study your word, to study the book of Daniel and the end times. We pray that you would guide us as we study. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Alright, so this week we're talking about Daniel and the end times. I'd like to begin by looking at Daniel chapter 2 and verse 47. All right, so just bear with me there while I pull that up on my screen. Daniel chapter 2 and looking at verse 47, which says, "The king answered Daniel and said, 'Surely your God is the God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal this secret.'" In order to understand Daniel's role in the end of time, we first need to look at the story of Daniel, looking at the role that he played in his time and why that came about. So we're going to start by looking at the situation with Israel and what the role of Israel was in God's plan. So if you go to Exodus chapter 19 verse 6, you'll see where God says, "And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." So Israel was essentially chosen to be God's witnesses to the surrounding nations. And if you look at their geographic location, you'll see that they're uniquely situated, especially at that time, amongst all these different pagan nations that pretty much surrounded them. And so they were supposed to be an influence rather than to be influenced by those surrounding territories. And we find that throughout history, there was this constant rebellion against God, where instead of them being an influence to the others, they started to want to be like the other nations. And we see a couple of examples of that throughout Scripture. First of all, we see that they wanted to have a king like the other nations did. They wanted to have the wealth and possessions and things like that, but they also wanted to commit some of the same sins and abominations that were detestable to God. The very things that God said to them, you cannot do these things, because if you do these things like the surrounding nations do, then you'll get punished like the surrounding nations. And you'll see that throughout the book of Deuteronomy. You'll see how God warned them that if they were obedient, many blessings would come as a result of the obedience, but if they chose to be disobedient, there would also come curses as a result. And ultimately, they began to go after the gods of the other nations and to worship them and to forget their God. And at one point, it's interesting where God says, "Has any nation ever forsaken their gods? Yet they had forsaken the Lord." And so, nations typically didn't depart from whatever religion was ingrained within that society, but yet the Israelites were going after strange gods, and God makes the point that these gods don't have power to see anything, they don't hear anything, they don't know anything, because they're just idols. But yet, they had given up the true God, who could hear and answer prayer, for nothing. And so ultimately, this led to them being punished, and first you had the northern tribes, that fell captive to the Assyrians. And if you look at the way that the northern tribes are situated, of the 20 kings that they had, not one of them did anything right. So all 20 kings of Israel were wicked and did the wrong thing in the sight of God. If you look at the southern tribes, most of them were wicked, but you had some exceptions to the rule, like Josiah, and I think there was one other one as well. Hezekiah, that's right. So it was Hezekiah and Josiah that were the best of the kings. And then you also had some kings that weren't as bad as some of their fathers were, but they were still pretty bad. They were setting up idols. They were setting up all kinds of crazy things to worship and to participating in the same activities as their pagan neighbors, rather than being an influence to them. So it got to a point where God had had enough, and he let them fall captive to the Babylonians. And that's pretty much where the story of Daniel picks up, where they've fallen captive to the Babylonians, and as Nebuchadnezzar and his armies destroyed the kingdom of Judah, some of the nobles and important men, or wise men, were carried north to Babylon, where they would serve in the king's palace if they were deemed worthy enough, if they were men of learning, and they could in some way contribute to Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. Daniel as well as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were chosen as some of the captives that would serve King Nebuchadnezzar. And this is interesting because here you have the nation falling to the captivity, and there's two different attitudes that you could take toward that. On the one hand, you could say, you know what, God has abandoned us. Let's just forget it and live doing what we want to do. Oh, I'm not going to show any allegiance to the king of Babylon. I'm gonna just live out the rest of my life. On the other hand, you could take the attitude, God has punished us. We deserved it. Now let's just have an attitude of repentance. And even though I can't do anything about the circumstances that I'm in, let me serve God in whatever capacity I'm in. And we'll see which one of those options Daniel chose. So first, let's look at Luke chapter 16, verse 10, which says, "He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much." The people had already proven that they would not be faithful to God. They had already, through their attitude of rebellion, rejected the Lord, and so in his rejection of them, they fell captive to the Babylonians. And of course, the northern tribes to the Assyrians. Now, Daniel's in this situation where, obviously the nation as a whole has already been proven unfaithful. And so Daniel chooses to have an attitude of faith. When we think about being faithful in what is least, the issue isn't just about what you're chosen to be faithful in. It's about the attitude of faithfulness that goes with it. So in other words, we could talk about being faithful in regard to perhaps something as simple as doing household chores, right? And it doesn't matter what the task is. What matters is the attitude behind your faithfulness in doing the task. And so Daniel chose to have an attitude of faithfulness in spite of the circumstances that he was in. He was going to be faithful in his responsibilities both on earth and also faithful in his responsibilities toward heaven. So it's more about the character of the individual, not what they're asked to do. So let's take a look at Daniel chapter 1, and we'll begin our story there. So we're going to learn a little bit more about the captivity and Daniel's situation. I'm going to read through a couple of the verses. It says here, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. And he besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand with part of the vessels of the house of the Lord, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. Which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, and that he should bring certain of these of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, the children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue or language of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they may stand before the king. Now among these of the children of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name Belteshazzar, unto Hananiah the name of Shadrach, unto Mishael the name of Meshach, and unto Azariah the name of Abed-nego. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. All right, so let me give you some context here behind what's going on. When the Babylonians conquered this territory, as was their custom, they would take some of the smartest people, some of the nobles that were available to them, and rather than killing everybody, they would make use of them by making them by taking them captive and letting them serve in the king's palace. these guys would sort of receive a certain level of special treatment. They would be nourished with the king's meat, so this was kind of like supposed to be an honor. They were given the king's delicacies. They were trained for about 3 years in the language of the Chaldeans and the sciences and different things that might have been useful. And then they would be allowed to serve if they proved worthy enough at the end of the 3 years. So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were three of the individuals from Judah that were chosen for this task. And they're offering these individuals the king's meat. Now, the problem with the king's meat, if you were Jewish, is the fact that this would have been meat that wouldn't be properly killed. It wouldn't be kosher. So it most likely would have been mingled with blood and possibly even offered up to the king's gods. And so by Daniel partaking of this meat, he would have to compromise his faith. Now, at this point, one attitude could be, hey, we've compromised enough already. Might as well do what the king wants. God has abandoned us. But Daniel doesn't take that attitude. Instead, Daniel takes a different attitude. He decides, okay, we messed up. Now let's start being faithful. So from Daniel's example, you can see that it's almost never too late in the game to make a turnaround and to be faithful. And so Daniel's purpose is he's not going to eat the king's meat, and he's not going to defile himself with the wine and with the things that they were going to be given. Now this is significant because you got to keep in mind that this isn't a hotel service. This isn't Daniel going on vacation to Babylon. He's a captive. And by him refusing the king's meat and the king's wine, it can be seen as an insult. And he could be killed on the spot just for having the audacity to refuse a gift from the king. Especially when this is pretty much a gesture of kindness on behalf of the king to these captives. We see that in verse 9, it says, Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Now, when it says here tender love, it means that it's brought him into, the person has compassion on him. That's another way of putting what the passage is really saying here. This isn't referring to a physical kind of tender love. He's saying that the prince of the eunuchs had compassion on him. And if you look up that same phrase elsewhere in Scripture, you'll see that it means the same thing. So it means basically that the person had compassion on him. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. So in other words, he's saying, I don't think this is such a good idea, Daniel. I understand that you don't want to eat this food, but if you don't eat it and you look worse than everybody else, the king's going to want my head. Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. So essentially, Daniel puts forward this test. He says, okay, I'm not going to eat the king's meat. I'm going to eat food that I know I can eat. And if after 10 days I look worse, then you do it with me what you feel like is best. But if after 10 days I look better, or if I look good, then I can continue eating this diet. So here Daniel steps out on faith. He has this 10-day challenge, essentially, where if he fails, it's basically all over for him. He would have to go back to eating the king's meat, or he would probably be forced to, if not lose his life. And the prince of the eunuch agrees and allows him to do this. And after 10 days, it turns out that Daniel and his companions who ate the pulse, or just the vegetables rather, fared better than everybody else. And so Daniel, stepping out in faith, God blessed him. And it even says here that God brought him into favor with the prince of the eunuchs. And so now that Daniel's got this attitude of faithfulness, we see that God is blessing him. Now, it goes on to tell us in verse 17, as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So here they refused to eat the king's meat. They stepped out on faith with this 10-day challenge. God blesses them and allows them to fare better than everybody else. And as a result of this faithfulness, God blesses them with even more, giving them knowledge, skill, wisdom, and Daniel in particular had understanding of visions and dreams. So it's showing us here the principle that when we step out in faith, God blesses us, and when we prove faithful in small things, He will bless us with more things. When we prove faithful in what He requires of us, and sticking to principle, then we can be blessed with spiritual things as well. We're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6 to 8, and I'm going to take a comment that's coming in. Deuteronomy chapter 4, looking at verse 6 to 8, which says, "Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear of these statutes and say, surely this great nation is wise and an understanding people. For what nation is there so great, who hath God so nigh unto them, as the Lord our God in all things that we call upon Him for? And what nation is there so great, that hath statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day?" So here we see that in keeping the law, in obeying God, they would be seen as those who have wisdom and understanding in the sight of other nations. So only through their obedience could they be witnesses to the surrounding nations. Next one, Zechariah chapter 8, and looking at verse 23. "Thus saith the Lord of hosts, in those days it shall come to pass that 10 men shall take hold out of all languages of the nations, even shall take hold of the skirt of him that is a Jew, saying, we will go with you, for we have heard that God is with you." So, in essence, these passages are showing us that the Jews were not to defile themselves with the things that the other nations did. They were given wisdom, they were given God's law, and they were given understanding so as to be a witness to the other nations. And as long as they were obedient, it would be profitable for everyone, because when God blesses them, He would allow them to be a blessing to other people. And it would be profitable for everyone and better for others as they were able to show forth the knowledge of God. Other nations would be blessed by that. They were supposed to be able to look at these individuals and from this kingdom and say, this is a wise and understanding people. And eventually, through this interaction, through this cultural diffusion, they would learn who the true God is. Now, another thing that I think is important is that when you look at Daniel chapter 1, and you see how Daniel was faithful in terms of his diet, we see that God blesses him with him and the 3 Hebrews with knowledge and understanding. So obviously through a good diet, a person can think clearer, their heads are clearer, they're better able to reason, and so there are intellectual benefits to having a good diet. But beyond that, God not only blesses them as a result of eating healthy, but He also blesses them with spiritual things as well. For example, Daniel's ability to understand dreams and visions. Now, when a person doesn't obey the health laws, obviously it's a lot harder to think clearer. It's a lot harder to to be able to do physical things that might need to be done. So eating healthy is an important thing. But Daniel's commitment wasn't just about diet alone, but about his faithfulness to God. And so in obeying, even in simple things, God blessed him with much. The next thing to look at in regard to Daniel is Daniel's humility. Now, all over the world, Daniel chapter 2 has been a story that we can look at, and we see the beginnings of prophecy, because Daniel chapter 2 is one of those chapters that gives a reason for faith and belief in God, specifically the God of the Bible, and it also provides powerful rationale or evidence, not just for the existence of God, but also for His foreknowledge and understanding of future events. So we're going to look at Daniel chapter 2, and we're going to look at how does this chapter provide such convincing evidence for the reality of God. I'm not going to read the whole chapter, as we're not going to have time to do that, but you'll get the gist of what I'm trying to say. I think we're in the future lessons, we're probably going to have to go through maybe a seminar on the book of Daniel, as this particular set of lessons doesn't really allow us to cover everything within the book of Daniel. But I do have a seminar series that we could do, if people are interested, that will allow us to talk about the book of Daniel and go through each prophetic chapter. But I'm just going to talk briefly about chapter 2. So, just to summarize, the king has a dream because he goes to bed at night thinking to himself, I wonder what's going to happen to my kingdom after me. God, for whatever reason in his wisdom, decides to give the king a dream that will outline for him world history, but he doesn't tell the king what the dream means, and he causes the king to forget the dream when he wakes up. Since King Nebuchadnezzar has a kingdom full of wise men who are supposed to have knowledge in all these types of things, such as dream interpretation or astrology or the sciences and all these different vast things that he's collected in his conquerings throughout his empire, he calls all the wise men forward and asks them to tell him the meaning of his dream and its interpretation. And when he realizes that nobody can do it, he becomes enraged. So imagine a king calling forward all the sidekicks, all the the fortune tellers, everybody who claims to have these supernatural powers, and then asking them to tell him what the dream is and what the meaning of the dream is, and yet nobody is able to do it because they're all fakes. So here he's been giving them the king's meat, he's been giving them the special wine, he's been putting up with them, he's giving them special treatment in his empire, and yet when it comes down to actually being able to do something supernatural and to help the king in some special way, none of them can do it. So King Nebuchadnezzar becomes enraged because he realized what most people realize, which is that all these psychics and astrologers and soothsayers and fortune tellers, etc., 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 Miss Cleo, John Edwards, the Long Island Medium, all of them are phony. If the king had at least just told them what the dream was, they could have made something up. But the king doesn't even remember his dream, so they don't even have something to go on where they could have just kind of made it up from scratch and said, oh, well, this is what it means. So enraged by the fact that none of them can do what they claim to be able to do, King Nebuchadnezzar orders all the wise men of Babylon to be killed. Eventually, this comes to Daniel and his companions because they're considered wise men since they were captured from Judah. They had a bunch of knowledge and understanding and wisdom, and so they were considered wise men as well, and they also were scheduled to die. But because Daniel was brought into favor by God with the captain of the king's guard, he asked for time that he would be allowed to consult the God of heaven for an interpretation of the king's dream. If we go to Daniel chapter 2, verse 14, it says, Then Daniel answered with counsel and wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, Why is the decree from the king so hasty? Then Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. Then Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time and that he would show the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his house, and he made the thing known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they should desire mercies of the God of heaven concerning this secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. So we see here that everybody's doomed to perish. But Daniel realizes that when his back is to the wall, there's a place that he can go to get answers where there are no answers. And so Daniel decides to consult with the God of heaven to find out what's going on. And when he prays, and when he and his companions come together and they pray, God reveals to Daniel in a night vision the interpretation of the king's dream. And as a result of what happens, Daniel blesses God. He says, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things. He knoweth what is in the darkness, and light dwelleth with him. I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who hast given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee, for thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter." So notice who Daniel gives the praise to as a result of the ability to interpret the king's vision. He doesn't take credit for himself. Instead, he recognizes and he blesses God for the ability to do what needs to be done, because he recognizes that ultimately this knowledge isn't from him, but comes from God. Now, the question that we must all be asking or thinking about at this point is, what does this have to do with end-time events? Well, first of all, we see that Daniel's humility keeps him in connection with God, so that when his back is to the wall, God comes through for him. If we approach last day events without an attitude of humility, then we can't expect that God is going to be with us through our trials and through our circumstances. We can't expect to be in close connection with God. So humility and connection with God go hand in hand. Secondly, Daniel's not taking credit for himself for what God does for him. He gives the credit where the credit is due. He exhorts and he praises God for how for how God has blessed him with the interpretation of this vision. And so people in the last days who are truly connected with God aren't going to be taking credit for themselves, but rather blessing and praising God when he comes through for them. So Daniel was in an attitude of praise. He was also in an attitude of prayer when things seemed like they were at their worst. Verse 24 says, "Therefore Daniel went in unto Arioch, whom the king had ordained to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went in and said thus unto him, Destroy not the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation." So basically, Daniel's brought into to King Nebuchadnezzar, and the king asked him if he's truly able to make known the vision. At this point, the king is without patience because nobody's able to do this. And Daniel says to him, "The secret which the king hath demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers, these people, they can't show this unto the king." And in verse 28 he says, "But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these." And then he begins to describe the dream that Nebuchadnezzar saw, which is important, because if he hadn't described the dream and just tried to jump to the interpretation, the king could have just thought he was making something up. But as Daniel began to describe the dream in such great detail of this image, whose form was awesome, a head of gold and chest and arms of silver, the loins of brass, and the legs of iron, and the feet of iron and miry clay. And then, of course, the stone which was cut out without hands, which smites the image on the feet. If he wasn't able to describe that, then the king wouldn't have known that he truly had seen the vision. After describing the dream in great detail, he then goes on to tell the king the interpretation. And the interpretation of this dream has end-time significance for us today. He starts off in verse 37 saying, here's the interpretation. He says, "Thou, O king, art a king of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory." And basically in verse 38 he tells him, "You are the head of gold." And then he describes the other metals that were seen on the image as kingdoms that would arise that were inferior to his kingdom. He describes the kingdom of silver, of brass, and of course of iron, then one of iron and miry clay. And of course the kingdom which arose after Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, was the Medes and the Persians. There was a third world empire that arose after the Medes and the Persians, which was of course Greece. And then after Greece you had the kingdom of iron, which was Rome. And then he does something interesting. In verse 41 he talks about after the fourth kingdom of iron, would come this kingdom of iron and miry clay, which would be a divided kingdom. So in verse 41 he says, "And whereas thou sawest the feet and toes and part of potter's clay and part of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, but there shall be in it of the strength of the iron, for as much as thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay. And as for the toes of the feet were part of iron and part of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly broken." And obviously, an individual has a total of 10 toes. So now we're talking about 10 divisions of the Roman Empire, which, based on history, we know that there were 10 Germanic tribes and 10 divisions of the Roman Empire. We also know that this empire, that the divisions of the Roman Empire are what we now know of as modern day Europe. They may try to work together from time to time. They've tried marriages between to make allegiances between nations, but for whatever reason, they cannot put the Roman Empire back together again. And this goes into the prophecy of verse 43, which says, "And whereas thou sawest the iron mixed with miry clay, they shall mingle themselves with the seed of men, but they shall not cleave one to another, even as iron is not mixed with clay." So he predicted a complete division of the Roman Empire, a tenfold division. And not only would there be this division, but that they would attempt to reunite, but every time they would try, it would fail. They would try through marriage. They would try through, just through peace treaties and through, sometimes even through conquest. But no matter what, they would not cleave one to another. Some would get together, others would fall apart. People like Charlemagne attempted to unite them, almost succeeded. He failed, and at the point of his death, he says, "God was too much for me," which indicates that he must have had knowledge of this prophecy. We see individuals like Napoleon, who tried to unite the Roman Empire back together again. Didn't work. They shall not cleave one to another. Now, even today, we see that that Europe is still divided. There is a such thing as the United Nations, but if you've been paying attention to what's going on in the news, they meet together, but they don't really work together and stick together and accomplish anything. They're not really a united force, a solitary unit that does anything. They talk, but they really don't cleave together as a single entity. Evidence of that, you can look at how the United Nations was trying just this past week to get Russia to stop lying and to agree to the mutually beneficial terms in regard to the chemical weapons and stuff like that they're said to have allowed Syria to unleash on its people. And when you look at how the nations were relating to each other in that setting, yes, they were meeting together, but they're not all on the same page. And so this brings us back to the prophecy of Daniel chapter 2, verse 43, which tells us that even though they might attempt, they will not cleave one to another. So this divided kingdom was the last part of the image. Some of it would be strong, some of it would be miry clay, just like iron doesn't mix with clay. These nations would not stay together. For a time, sometimes they unite to certain nations will unite with other nations to do certain things, but as a whole, they do not. They do not unite together. Then we're told that after this, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all the kings, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest the stone was cut from out of the mount, that was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it break in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain and the interpretation is sure. So God is going to set up an everlasting kingdom in the days of modern day Europe, and his kingdom will never fade. And so when you look at what took place here in Daniel chapter 2, God gave Nebuchadnezzar a history, an outline of world historical events from Daniel's time all the way down to the end of time. So he talked about Nebuchadnezzar's time as the head of gold, He talked about and predicted the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. He talked about and predicted the rise of the Grecian Empire, the rise of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire into the 10 divisions of that, which now equate with modern-day Europe, and then said that in the days of those kings, he's going to set up an everlasting kingdom, which would never be destroyed. So this shows us that if the last kingdom to exist, the toes of this prophecy representing modern-day Europe, would be just before the everlasting kingdom is set up and the end of the world, now we know that we're actually living literally in the toenails of Bible prophecy. And so Daniel chapter 2 shows us where we are on the prophetic timeline. We're living in the last days. Let's move on to Daniel chapter 3. There's a lot more that we could get into in regard to Daniel chapter 2 and the prophetic events, but we're not going to be going through all those prophecies today. Next we see this issue of a golden image. I'm not going to read the whole chapter. You can read it on your own if you like, but I'm just going to kind of summarize what takes place here. Nebuchadnezzar, after receiving the vision in Daniel chapter 2 where he sees the image with different metals, decides to set up his own image made of entirely gold. My guess, even though it's not explicitly said, is that the reason why he does this is to symbolize his kingdom lasting forever, or at the very least until the end of time when God decides to set up his everlasting kingdom. So he kind of rejects this whole idea, even though he defers to Daniel, and at the end of Daniel chapter 2, he gives Daniel honor. He bows down before Daniel and acknowledges his God as the supreme God and the most powerful God who could reveal secrets. He promotes Daniel. He promotes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. He pays homage to the God of heaven. But now by Daniel chapter 3, even though he has the head knowledge of the existence of God, he defiantly creates this golden image that he requires everybody to bow down to. Now, this is significant because, first of all, it shows us that it takes more than just a head knowledge of God to understand the Bible and prophetic events. Nebuchadnezzar understood that Daniel's God was the true God, yet it doesn't seem to bring him to repentance or any kind of transformation and change, at least at this point. He sets up this image requiring everybody to bow down before it, and the 3 Hebrews tell him that they're not going to do it. Let's look at Daniel chapter 3, verse 1 to 6. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, in other words 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together the princes and governors and captains and judges and treasurers and counselors and sheriffs and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, governors, captains, judges, treasurers, and counselors and sheriffs and rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whoso falleth not down and worshipeth shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." Now, if you're Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, you're in a tight spot at this point because you realize that there's only one God in heaven, and yet the king wants you to bow down to this golden image. And you also know the second commandment, you shall not bow down and worship graven images. So it would have been easy for the 3 Hebrews to say, hey, it's just one time. Maybe God will overlook it. We're captives. We don't have a choice. We don't want the king to kill us. But instead, the 3 Hebrews decide to take a stand of faith. And they defy the king, refusing to bow down before the image. And so they're brought before the king, and King Nebuchadnezzar is angry at the fact that they did not bow down. But at first he gives them another chance. He says, I'll give you another chance. If when you hear the music, you bow down and you worship my image, great. If not, I'm going to throw you into the furnace. And boldly, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego answer the king, and they say, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. If it be so, In other words, this is the way it's got to be. Our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Now what's fascinating is that the last thing that Nebuchadnezzar had said to them is, who is the God that shall deliver you out of my hands? So essentially he's saying, you guys think that you're going to rely on your God to save you from me if you refuse to bow down to this image. What God is going to deliver you from my hands? It's almost like he had amnesia from Daniel chapter 2. But it seems that while he was willing to accept that God could reveal secrets and was certainly powerful, he doesn't yet recognize how all-powerful God is. And he thinks that because he was allowed to conquer the kingdom of Judah, that his gods were more powerful than the one and only true God. So in other words, by Israel's disobedience and God allowing them to fall into captivity, they actually did God a disservice, because the nations which captured them actually think that their gods are more powerful than the true God, not realizing that God purposely allowed them and used them as an instrument to punish his people because of their disobedience. And now they're all in a situation where Nebuchadnezzar actually thinks he's got gods that are more powerful than the God of heaven, because after all, hey, he conquered Jerusalem, didn't he? And so when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego basically stand up to the king and say, hey, we're not going to bow down before your image, and God is able to deliver us, and even if he chooses not, we won't worship your gods. And so the king gets angry, and he deliberately has the furnace heated to 7 times hotter. He knows something about this number 7 in the Bible. He knows something about it, and so he decides it's perhaps an insult to God to heat the furnace 7 times hotter, and then throw the 3 Hebrews in the furnace. And so he does this, as we see in chapter 13 through 18, and the furnace is heated so hot that when the guards go to throw him in, to throw the 3 of them in, they die in the process. But when they fall into the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar looks into the furnace and he becomes astonished, because rather than seeing 3 men in there, he sees 4, and they're all standing and walking around, untouched and unhurt by the fire. Verse 24 says, Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said to his counselors, Did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They said unto the king, True, O king. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. And perhaps from Daniel chapter 2, when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, he would have known what the Son of God looked like from his dream. And so now he gets this reminder, and he calls the 3 Hebrews out, and they come out of the fire. And then Nebuchadnezzar basically, again, pays homage to God. And he says, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants that trusted in him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree, that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego in the province of Babylon. So now I guess they got a new promotion as a result of surviving this trial. Now the question that you must have is, okay, well, what does this have to do with end-time events? Well, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego were tested and were asked, and had to prove faithful, in the last days there will also be a test for God's people. Let's take a look at Revelation chapter 13. And we're looking at verses 13 to 18. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of what this prophecy means, because we don't have time to go through both Daniel and Revelation, but basically what takes place here is that at the end of time, this beast power will arise, and we know it's the Roman power. This beast power will arise, and it's going to enforce a death decree unless all agree to worship and to pay homage to the beast. And as a result of this worship, these individuals will receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. And of course, this mark is not a literal mark, but is a symbolic mark. And when I say a symbolic mark, I mean that it represents what you do with the hand, and it represents what you think with the mind. The way that you can understand the mark of the beast, see, a lot of people think it's like some kind of computer chip, and so that would mean that if you have a certain type of computer chip in your hand or in your head, that is the mark of the beast. And that's actually not the mark of the beast. And I would like to actually submit to you today that the mark of the beast could have been enforced years ago before we had any of this technology that we have today. So technology does not make or break this prophecy. And technology is also not needed to enforce what this prophecy talks about. This could have happened just as easily during the Dark Ages as it can today. That being said, I'm not suggesting that technology won't be used when the mark of the beast is enforced. Very well a possibility. I'm just saying that it's not dependent upon any form of technology whatsoever. And to understand the mark of the beast as a piece of technology, whether it be a tattoo, a special chip, or whatever, is a mistake. Instead, the mark of the beast represents the actions that one takes with, it represents, the hand represents what you do, the head represents what's in the mind. The best way to understand the mark of the beast is to also understand the seal of God. I actually have an article written about this that you can see in our archives, talking about seals and marks. You'll look at the book of Deuteronomy where it says, when we're talking about God's commandments, and it says, bind them for a sign upon thy hand, let them be as frontlets between thine eyes. So we see that the commandments of God were to be in the hand as well as frontlets between the eye, in other words, in the head. And if you look at the New Covenant, it tells us, God says, I will write my law in their hearts. Where's the heart? The mind. I will write my law in their hearts, in their inward parts. I will be to them a God. They shall be to me a people. Well, what does it mean to have the law of God written in the heart or in the mind? It means to naturally do the things that naturally do the things that are contained in the laws. Now, another thing that's fascinating about this is the Bible teaches us, blessed are they which do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life. It's not the hearers of the word that are just before God, but the doers. So, in essence, the law of God must be in the mind as well as in our actions. And so that represents the seal of God. Bind up the testimony, seal the law among my disciples. Where is it sealed? It's sealed in the mind as well as in the actions. Who does the sealing? Grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, grieve not the Holy Spirit of God, whereby thou art sealed unto the day of redemption. So it's the Holy Spirit that does the sealing of the law of God within the mind and within the action. We see that the seal of God is the obedience to his law, which includes the fourth commandment. The mark of the beast would be the opposite. Disobedience to the law of God in the mind as well as in the actions. That's just kind of a brief summary of what the mark of the beast and the seal of God is all about. I'm not getting into the explicit detail. But there will also be an outward test of that obedience. Let me put it this way. In the commandments of God, many of them are internal as opposed to external. You can't see whether or not I have murderous thoughts. You can't see whether or not I have an adulterous heart. You can't see whether or not I covet. But the Sabbath is an outward sign. It's one of those commandments where you have to do it outwardly in order for a person to recognize that it's kept. The Sabbath will become a test in the end times, whereas in contrast to the mark of the beast, which will be a counterfeit Sabbath, and all who do not obey this counterfeit Sabbath will show outwardly their disobedience to the law of God. And in doing so, they will be paying homage to the beast. And the beast power has its own counterfeit Sabbath, which is essentially Sunday worship. That's why they could say in the Catholic Record, London, Ontario, in September, I think it's 1st, 1923, the church is above the Bible, and the transference of Sabbath observance to Sunday is proof positive of that fact. So in other words, they said, and they also said, if you deny the authority of the church, then you have no grounds by which to substantiate this change. I'm actually just paraphrasing the quote there. Now, this is significant because they claim that they created the counterfeit Sabbath. It is their Sunday, and the church being over the Bible is the grounds by which they had to do it. So in the end times, there will be an image made to the beast, and the beast will cause everyone to worship him, and he will cause everyone to disregard God's commandments for its commandments, and all who are small, great, rich, poor, free, bond, all of them will receive this mark. I'm over generalizing because I don't have a lot of time to get into the details with this lesson. But there's going to be a test of faith, and people are going to have to choose which side they're on. Either you lose the ability to buy and sell, you lose the ability to do a lot of the things that you might want to do, or that you might have ambitions to do with your life, if you choose not to serve the beast and you choose to side with God. On the other hand, if you want to take the easier route, at least the seemingly easier route, and you worship the beast, then on earth you have all of the things you might want, but yet you're starving for what heaven has to offer. And so you can't have it both ways. Either you're going to side with God, or you're going to side with the beast. And of course, it's the devil who gives power to this beast. And everyone who is not written in the book of life is going to receive the mark of the beast. And so just like in Daniel's time where the three Hebrews saw this image that was set up, and they had to stand when everybody else was bowing down, in the same way in the last days when this counterfeit Sabbath is set up, and people are told to bow before the beast, people are going to have to be standing rather than bowing down. And so there's going to come a test of faith in the end times. Let's look at Daniel chapter 4, verse 30, which says, "The king spake and said, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty?" So here we see the pride of Nebuchadnezzar. He didn't recognize his dependency on God. So here he's had two encounters with God, and yet still he's got the sense of pride. It's all about him. If we look down at verse 35, "And all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doeth according to his will in the army of heaven among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, What doest thou?" So we see a massive transition in thought between, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling for my royal majesty," in verse 30, to "The God of heaven is God, and nobody can stop him from doing what he wants to do," in verse 35. What made all the difference? Well, Nebuchadnezzar goes through this experience through those verses from verse 30 to verse 35, where he's made to live like an animal because he will not acknowledge the Most High as God and as sovereign. And so basically his kingdom is stripped from him temporarily, and he's living like an animal. His hair's grown, he's clawing at the ground, he's eating grass like an oxen. Actually, I'll read it in verse 32. It says, and they shall drive thee from men, and thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make thee eat grass like as oxen, and 7 times shall pass over thee, until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. So in other words, God gave Nebuchadnezzar a humbling experience that put him in a situation where he had no choice but to acknowledge God. And finally, Nebuchadnezzar got the picture, and he was willing to humble himself before God and recognize that God is the one who sets up kings and gives the kingdom to whomever he chooses. And it wasn't until Nebuchadnezzar finally acknowledged God that he was restored to his kingdom and his dominion was given back to him. And it says in verse 34 that he praised and honored God, the God who lives forever, and whose dominion is an everlasting dominion. So now Nebuchadnezzar had what's called a conversion experience. Before he had a head knowledge of God, he knew that there was a God who was powerful, but now through this experience, he truly started to get it, where he acknowledged God as sovereign. And sovereign not just over other people, not just over Jews, but over everyone, even over him. So, again, much of this happens through Daniel's witness. And so in the last days, we are called to be witnesses for God, to lead people to an understanding of God and to a heart knowledge of God. So we talked about how through humility, Daniel was able to have an influence over these pagans. Through standing for his faith, he was able to, through his faithfulness, introduce them to the true God. And also through his faithfulness, it led to Gentiles, non-Jews, non-believers, essentially being converted and coming to know and coming into the knowledge of God and into a relationship with him as well. What was it about Daniel that allowed for this to happen? Well, first we saw in chapter 1 Daniel's faithfulness, and we see another example of this in chapter 6 when he meets the new king, King Darius. Let's take a look at Daniel chapter 6, and we're going to look at verses 4 and 5. So after the fall of Babylon, as was predicted, the Medes and the Persians took over, and Daniel gains favor with Darius and ends up serving in the king's court. So basically, Daniel served under two empires, both the Babylonians and the Medes and the Persians. It says in verse 4 and 5, Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion for fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Then said these men, We shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. So these men couldn't trip Daniel up. They couldn't find fault against Daniel because he did everything so faithfully, not just to God, but also to secular rulers. So he was so faithful in his job and also faithful to God that there was nothing negative that could be said about him. So in order for them to find some way of getting rid of him, they had to basically find fault, find a way to bring Daniel's religion in conflict with his duties to the king. So he was faithful to God and to all his secular responsibilities. And in the same way, if we're going to survive in the last days and truly be witnesses, we too must be found faithful, not just to God, but also to our secular responsibilities. And as we saw in Revelation chapter 13, those who don't go with the program, those who take a stand, are going to be put to death. So there will be a death decree, which will force people to either accept the mark or perish. In Daniel's time, basically they made this law that nobody could bow before or nobody could pray to any god except the king for 30 days. And they flatter the king and get him to sign this decree. And he does so without thinking about Daniel. And then after he does, they publish this law thinking that, okay, they got Daniel now. They're either going to stop him from praying and make it difficult for him to practice his religion, or they can throw him into a den of lions. And we find that Daniel continues to go to an open window and pray visibly and publicly, as he normally did, for all to see. And he prays through this open window toward Jerusalem in the sight of these men, and so they were able to take him and put him on trial. And the king, realizing what's going on, becomes remorseful because he didn't realize in signing that law that somebody like Daniel would be affected. Daniel was a faithful servant. He didn't want Daniel to be thrown into the lion's den, and he was sorry that he had made the law at that point. But the law of the Medes and the Persians does not alter, and so even if the king wanted to, which he did, he could not change the law. And he goes through many different things. He tries his hardest to try to repeal that law, to find some way around it, to find some loophole in it, but he can't. And so he's forced to put his friend, Daniel, his friend and his servant, into the lion's den. But the last thing he says to him is that his God will deliver him. And so the only way that he could know that is because of the talks that he had with Daniel and the respect that he had come to have for Daniel's God through their talks together. And so all night the king can't sleep because he's worried about Daniel's safety in the lion's den. They had sealed the den so nobody could get out. And it appears for a time as if those who were plotting against Daniel had won. And obviously the king's not happy about what they pulled because Daniel was a trusted servant, a trusted advisor, somebody who was useful to the king, somebody who the king greatly admired and respected and wanted to have around. But the next morning, when the king gets up and he opens the lion's den, he calls out to Daniel and he says, "Daniel, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you?" So there you see the faithfulness of Daniel. Because Daniel was faithful, the king said, "Hey, has your God whom you serve faithfully continually been able to deliver you?" Another thing is interesting. Let me read verse 20. "And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God." Notice he calls him the living God. So through Daniel's association with the king, he had come to know that Daniel's God was the living God. He says, "Is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions?" Then said Daniel unto the king, "O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, I have done no hurt." So here we see that God sends an angel to deliver Daniel from the hungry lions, and the lions don't hurt Daniel. And so Daniel, yet again, through this miracle, shows the king that there's a God in heaven who answers prayers and who delivers his servants. And so the king then commands those who had accused Daniel and set up this situation to be thrown into the lion's den, but not just them, but also their children and their wives. And the lions devoured all of them, and they didn't survive the encounter. And so the king wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in the earth, "Peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever, and his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in the earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So we see here that through Daniel's faithfulness, and God working through Daniel, that he was able to witness to King Darius, and he became a believer. So from this, we can take away a couple of things. First, that faithfulness is needed if we're going to survive the events of the last days, because without faith, it's impossible to please God. It's impossible for us to get anywhere. We're not going to see any miracles happen without faith. Faith is basically the key that unlocks heaven's storehouse. And so without faith, we can't survive. We're not going to be able to stand during the time of trouble that's going to come upon this earth as Revelation depicts it. Through faithfulness, we will see the conversion of many Gentiles who will come to believe because of our witness. We're going to have to stand during times of hardship where others ask us to bow down and to worship something that would take the place of God, and we're going to have to stand for the true God, even if it means death. And it's going to take an extreme amount of humility in order for us to be able to survive this, because humility puts us in connection with God and allows God to be able to use us, whereas pride draws us away from God and makes us all about ourselves. And it starts with faithfulness in what is least. So in order for us to have the great faith that it's going to take to stand in the last days, it has to be practiced in the things that are least, in our day-to-day experiences, and even in our secular responsibilities, just as Daniel did. All right, so those are just some connections between Daniel and the end times. That's all the time that we have for tonight. Let's close with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the blessing in being able to read and study your word and learn about prophecy. Guide us, we pray, and help us to be ready for the end times. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thank you for coming, everyone. Good night.